And there we go. So now we're all being recorded, so everybody can be on their best behavior. And in light of that, I would like to introduce Fatima Razzaq and her colleagues Simone and Greg. Fatima is the director in the Department of Housing in Massachusetts. I'm going to let her introduce herself and her work, and also introduce in depth her colleagues Simone and Greg. Needless to say, we are really delighted to have them with us today. They bring huge expertise and relevant experience to us, so we're excited about listening to you. Fatima, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and just as a disclaimer, I'm working off two screens, so my apologies if I'm looking off camera for part of this. So hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our presentation. We're so very excited to have this opportunity to discuss our work in Massachusetts public housing, so thank you so much for having us. To start, my name is Fatima Razzaq, and I'm joined by my colleagues Simone Early and Greg Abbey. We all work for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD. I expect that we're going to speak for about a half an hour, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have about our work. We plan to give you an overview of DHCD and public housing. We're going to describe the CHARM study, which was a major project for our department, the toolkits that came out of that study, and some challenges that we identified through this process. So before we dive into the details of our resiliency work, I think it's really important to orient you within our department and our day-to-day work, because we're sort of in this very unique space within the overall field of affordable housing, and describing that will sort of help you understand some of the challenges that we're facing in our work. So to start, we work for the Department of Housing, and we're in the Division of Public Housing. Our roles specifically are in the Bureau of Housing Development and Construction. Our day-to-day focus is on implementing capital projects on the public housing units. So we take them from conception into design and all the way through the completion of construction. There are two types of public housing, federal and state. Federal public housing is probably what you are most familiar with. This is housing that is funded and overseen by HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They oversee about 3,300 local housing authorities across the country and approximately 1.2, 1.3 million units of public housing. You'll find federal public housing in every state. Massachusetts, however, is unique in that we have both federally funded public housing, and we are one of 4 states in the country that also has state-aided public housing. The other 3 states are Connecticut, Hawaii, and New York. So this means that we, the state, provide capital and operating funds for the 43,000 units of state public housing in Massachusetts. We also provide management and oversight of about 240 local housing authorities across the state. So why does this matter? This creates some unique challenges and opportunities for us. Most importantly, we are not eligible for federal public housing funds generally, or their specific grant programs. So for example, all of those amazing ideas in the Green New Deal about rehabbing public housing to be as sustainable as possible does not apply to our public housing, our state-funded public housing. We are not eligible for those funds. As you can see in the graph, federal public housing in general has higher and more flexible funding. So if you look at the total column, you can see on an average per unit basis, a state unit is producing about $745 per month, whereas federal is about $1,030. On an annual basis, that really totals up. The other difference also is that in federal public housing, they can commingle their capital and operating subsidies, whereas in the state portfolio, we are not able to do that. Our funding serves very specific purposes. So while we face many of the same challenges as HUD, DHCD is forced to be more creative with our solutions since we're so challenged on the funding side. On the other hand, federal public housing is stifled by an obscure piece of legislation called the Faircloth Amendment, which says that HUD cannot fund the creation of new federal public housing units if the construction of those units would result in a net increase in the number of units that the Housing Authority owns as of a limit that was set in 1999. Massachusetts public housing is not subject to this rule, so we are able to more freely develop new units or creatively redevelop our existing units. Another unique benefit to being outside of the federal portfolio is that we have the flexibility to create and set our own policy. Because of this, we've really leaned into prioritizing sustainability and resiliency as areas of focus for our portfolio. Which brings me to our topic for today, DHCD's CHARM study, or the Climate Hazard and Resilience Master Plan. So this was an effort we undertook to assess the climate risk of our public housing portfolio, develop resiliency guidelines, and create a strategic plan for implementation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Simone to dive more into the CHARM study. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Thanks, Fatima. Good morning. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a legislative dive into our projects. Our department benefits from, can everybody hear me? I hope so. Our department benefits from a government which is proactively trying to mitigate the issues of climate change. So to set the stage for our project, I'll just kind of quickly go over what Massachusetts is doing. Obviously, we're part of Massachusetts, but I mean by executive order. Massachusetts Executive Order 484, leading by example, established a higher energy efficiency standard for Massachusetts state facilities to address the mitigation of climate change through greenhouse gas reduction goals. However, climate change is already having a demonstrable effect in Massachusetts and across the globe. So in September 2016, Governor Baker issued Executive Order 569, directing the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs and the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security to develop an integrated state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, which we call SHMCAP, in order to assist all state agencies in developing their own climate adaptation plan. This new state plan builds on the previous state hazard mitigation plans as required by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, under the Robert T. Stafford Act of 1988 and the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. The SHMCAP summarizes the best available scientific information on climate change in Massachusetts. It describes the interaction of climate change and natural hazards and develops adaptation strategies to mitigate risk and increase resiliency. The SHMCAP has been developed in response to the need to address and the benefits of addressing climate change through an integrated strategy across the state. This plan was published in 2018. In addition, the Division of Capital Asset Management and Maintenance, DCAM, which is our public facility oversight, developed a state resiliency master plan to assess the vulnerability of state facilities to climate change related weather events and conditions, ranking them by risk, assessing vulnerability of selected pilot sites, and making preliminary recommendations for resilience investments. Our DHCD CHARM project was developed to follow the general outline of the DCAM SRMP, which did not cover housing authorities because they're considered quasi-state government agencies, while using updated climate change projections from the SHMCAP to assess the vulnerability of the state-funded public housing portfolio. Sorry about that. So what does that legislation represent and what did it mean for our project? By the end of the century, Massachusetts residents are expected to face new challenges, including hotter summer days, increased rainfall, and rising sea level. According to the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, Massachusetts can expect to experience up to 64 days a year of over 90-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Last summer, it was only about 10 days, just to give you some insight. A 16% increase in rainfall and between 4 and 10.5 feet of sea level rise at the coast. As a result of these pressures from climate change, residents will face longer and hotter summers, heat waves, increased likelihood of basement, first floor, and entryway flooding, and possible displacement from their homes during storm surge events. Increased heat will challenge our residents, in particular with health issues, while restricting mobility and outdoor recreation. Flooding could damage critical building systems and limit access. Displacement during climate emergencies could disrupt schooling and employment. Obviously, we're doing that now. Routines that form the basis of our residents' success and growth. Planning for and adapting to these challenges in advance has been the focus of our CHARM project, and the adaptations recommended in a resiliency toolkit are developed to leverage existing assets to adapt in advance of climate change impacts. So in order to assess these issues, we did a request for services and selected to work with a couple consultants, New Ecology and Kleinfelder. New Ecology in particular works across the Eastern Seaboard. The overall goal was to understand the climate risks and vulnerabilities in the state-funded portfolio and then translate the best practices for mitigation and adaptation into the routine planning processes, which DHCD already has, trying to be opportunistic with other projects that were already in development, with the goal of fully integrating these practices into our capital project system. The main task of the CHARM study the main tasks were to establish a peer review group panel, as well as surveying the LHAs, the local housing authority developments, and from there to develop a research methodology. To do this, the consultant did a large-scale risk and vulnerability assessment to understand the future climate risks and impacts of the development, similar to what DCAM did. The consultants then ground truth these assessments with a series of pilot assessments at five housing authority developments to really understand that the desktop analysis translated what existed on the sites. And then from that, they built the various toolkits directed at specific stakeholders that we work with, the local housing authorities, the design consultants that we hire, and DHCD, us as the regulator, to integrate the findings into our capital process, and also to set some funding priorities and timelines for implementation. So keeping in mind that the LHAs are quasi-state agencies only regulated by us, our approach was to work with all of the local housing authority entities. So the 240 sometimes shows up as 250 depending on when the number gets produced, because we are constantly shifting a little bit with federal. We did a survey which had about 15 questions to understand things like emergency preparedness, backup power availability, and previous climate events. We had a relatively good response of 30%, which is better than some studies we do. And for the authorities that did not respond, we used our best estimates based on our capital inventory, which is fairly extensive. The risk and vulnerability desktop analysis was done with the goal to understand the vulnerability in the future for each development, the 1,320 that we have, and then rank them based on their vulnerability and risk. This was a large, really large spreadsheet data analysis in which we normalized the large set of data input values with feedback from the peer group that we had, which provided direction on weighting of the point scale to understand which items were most important to DHCD as the regulator, the LHA management team, and to the residents. Then they scored every development and ranked them according to their priority. The climate projections that were used in the study, such as increased precipitation and rising temperatures, matched those of the State Climate Adaptation and Hazard Mitigation Plan, which I talked about earlier, the SHMCAP, matched those data sets, and they also matched the flood risk model so that we would be in sync with the state data as that changed over time. All of these projections were then mapped. You can see the darker colors represent the most at-risk developments. So this one for precipitation, the most affected developments were in the eastern part of the state. For storm surge, we discovered that actually relatively few developments will be affected by that hazard, as you can see just here, but that the ones that were impacted will be severely impacted, significant flooding. And for the extreme temperatures, the key takeaway was that part of the state will be moving to a warmer climate zone by mid-century. So the current climate zone of 5A in the eastern part of the state will be migrating into a zone 4A by mid-century. So basically on the eastern seaboard, Massachusetts will be similar to Maryland. Finally, the analysis combined the exposure graphics, showing the combined vulnerability and risk as an index in order to do a prioritization. The outcome then was showing that only about 180, you can see here, this is the high category, of the 1,300 developments really needed to prioritize their climate hazard risks, which is maybe better than we thought. And we're hoping to update this analysis probably every 5 years. The last analysis involved a pilot site assessment of 5 sites, randomized for various types, elderly, family, and special need developments, which make up our portfolio, and for the condition of hazards at the developments across the state. So New Ecology assessed the utilities, did an interview with the LHA staff, did a site walkthrough, and did a solar PV feasibility study. From these visits, they reported on resilience opportunities, energy and water saving opportunities, and recommended solar PV availability on those sites. When we then further had New Ecology go out to the top 10 vulnerable high-risk LHAs to do further recommendations specific to them. So of that 180, the top 10 were the ones they went out to. Some of those were already in the pilot, so we had limited further access on those. And from these reports, DHCD assessed the cost against our own cost models and created a series of high priority projects and determined a solar PV and battery study to be done at multiple developments. The top recommended projects from the site assessments were air infiltration and making envelopes tighter, installing backwater valves, providing potable water storage, mitigating for extreme heat, floodproofing, and not shown here, a recommendation to do emergency preparedness plans at all local housing authorities. A few have them, but very few. And we also set the design flood elevation for all of these 10 sites. All of these analyses were then translated into the resiliency toolkits, building and site guidelines, rapid resiliency and vulnerability assessments, and the consultant also created the emergency preparedness template and guidelines. Each of the documents were aimed at specific target audiences with varying degrees of construction understanding. So the graphics for the LHAs versus certain more explicit design guidelines for designers that we frequently use. So this graphic for the design guidelines was for the LHAs. The primary focus looked at 2 main building typologies, our high rises and lower garden types of 2-story buildings, which these are our largest building types. From this was produced a graphic for easy understanding. You can see the graphics point to the various areas and recommend solutions. The more extensive guidelines were produced, which in a more narrative fashion, describing the best practices, and were tied to our existing DHCD guidelines used for our design consultants. 35 sections were revised of the 52 sections of the guidelines that we currently have. In addition, they added specific symbols along each guideline to indicate heat, storm surge, precipitation, the different hazards. The consultant also developed suggestions on how to add resiliency to our typical capital planning process with flags for the exposure on the capital inventory that we have, which is an extensive program that we use. And this was to integrate the resilience into projects from those inventory items. This included a toolkit to track resiliency with a score and links to the recommended design guidelines. So like if you said, I have flooding in my basement, yes, then it would tell you which guidelines to take a look at. This tool uses a set of yes or no questions similar to the original survey, so hopefully it will help us update that RVA as we go along. The last tool was the Emergency Preparedness Operating Guidelines and Template, which identifies the protocols for buildings and systems, residents, evacuation, and sheltering in place. This guide points out the need to step out of the strictly pragmatic discussion of our capital projects. It is worth recognizing that clearly the conversation has shifted around adaptive capacity this past year. And this time we cannot just be about the logistics of construction. Out in the world, people can feel adrift on a wave of not knowing whether they should have their masks on or off. Can I hug my favorite people? Am I standing too close to you? So when one goes home, it's important that it is really a place where you can feel like yourself. But at the same time, we have to remain in community. And one of the most important elements for that is a space of safe interaction, kind of like what we're having here today. So in the more generalized sphere of our work as designers and public housing providers, the perception of the public realm has been transformed by the pandemic, I would say. And it leaves me with questions around what insights will refocus our energy to be a more resilient, human-centered social infrastructure in the face of these new challenges. And even with the vaccine, I think these definitions have sort of permanently changed. In low-income housing, how do we bring our residents back to community when community is the biggest means of resilience for so many situations? All of our initiatives are based in using community to support social and economic mobility and stability. So to me, this is a pressing question, a question that hopefully can be assisted with thoughtful planning, design, and developing opportunity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg now to speak more specifically about some of our projects and challenges in the charm.
Thanks, Simone. Let me get this going here. Okay, can folks see and hear me all right? All right, so I'll talk today about some of the challenges to implementing all of the fantastic work that came out of our CHARM study. First and foremost, it's worth recognizing that the public housing portfolio is, generally speaking, old. It averages about 55 years old, with 53% being built before 1970, and that means that there are all kinds of components of the building that we have to take into account, whether we know it's there or we don't, when we're planning projects, including asbestos, lead, aging electrical panels that can't support new equipment unless you replace them, that sort of thing. Also, code in the 60s or the 70s even was nowhere near as rigorous as it is today in terms of, say, envelope performance, insulation, air sealing, ventilation requirements, etc. And the position of moisture and vapor barriers within buildings doesn't always lend itself to adding things like air conditioning, which we might want to do in those developments, which is most of them, that we expect to be exposed to extreme heat in the future. In addition, when we have limited funding and we have older developments, that means that there are a lot of sort of overdue or remaining challenges that we haven't gotten to yet, to say nothing of the resiliency work that we're looking to do going forward. There's about $1.6 billion in deferred maintenance on all of these different developments across the Commonwealth, and we've got $100 million annually to spend on 40,000 units, which you'd think would go reasonably far, but it doesn't always go as far as we'd like, hence the maintenance backlog. So that means that projects that you might think of as being routine can very quickly become complicated projects. Just as a couple of examples to help illustrate that, let's say we want to do a project to address extreme heat in a development. And we want to add air conditioning to ductwork that's there, but the ductwork right now only really provides heat. If that ductwork, let's say, is uninsulated and it's within the walls, then if we add air conditioning to it, now we run the risk of condensation occurring on the ductwork within the wall, and that's a mold hazard. So then we need to access that ductwork to make sure that it's sealed up and insulated. However, the walls containing that ductwork have asbestos in them. So now there has to be a remediation project. You might want to add that air conditioning to an electrical panel that cannot support additional service. And so you need to replace that. And let's say you want to do attic insulation. There might not be access to the attic. In some of these buildings, there is no access. And that means you have to cut through what could be lead paint. You have to test for that and make sure that you remediate it if it's there. And oftentimes there's very little either mechanical ventilation, and sometimes there isn't even ventilation in the attic to make sure that those attic spaces are cooled properly during the summer. Or if you wanted to address riverine flooding, if you're close to a wetland, which many developments are, they were built on land that was relatively inexpensive and undesirable back 50, 60 years ago, there are restrictions that come with trying to do projects right next to a wetland. If you have outdoor utilities and you need to, let's say, elevate them, you have to first establish who owns the utilities. Is it the utility company? Is it the housing authority? Who has to be involved? Who's responsible for permitting, expense, etc.? And then for something like porous pavement, which might better alleviate runoff, that has increased maintenance costs because it has to be managed very carefully to make sure that you don't damage the porous surfaces. So that's just a couple of hopefully illustrative examples about how something as simple in theory as, well, we'll just add air conditioning and do better insulation in a building to address the extreme heat, can very quickly lead to a large project to address a whole host of hazards. And that's all couched within this context of having a limited budget. Like I said, we've got $100 million in capital funds for 40,000 units. And then in addition to that, DHCD has allocated about $5 million per year for sustainability generally. And that includes greenhouse gas emission reducing projects, resiliency projects, and projects that improve indoor air quality. So all three of those draw from that $5 million of sustainability funding. As Simone mentioned, there are about 180 high-risk developments in terms of climate hazards. And so if we were to do 16 projects per year, we'd be able to address all of those 180 developments in about 11 years or so. Sorry, no, I'm referring to the second bit, the $300,000 per resiliency-focused project. We've got some pilot projects going on, and that's what the ticket tends to be on each of these. And they span the gamut from flood-proofing buildings to envelope projects to elevating equipment, etc. So with our $5 million budget, we could address 16 projects per year if there are no cost overruns. And then we'd be able to get to all of those 180 developments in about 11 years. But that means that there's no more sustainability funding for greenhouse gas emissions reductions or indoor air quality. So there are a lot of different priorities and things that we want to do, and just sometimes not enough funding to accomplish all of them as quickly as we would like. Another challenge is on the operations side. Housing authorities, in many cases, are very, very small. They have a very limited staff. In many cases, you might have one full-time employee and a number of other part-time employees. And so those folks are working on a lot of different things, maintaining the buildings, planning capital projects, working with tenants, you name it. Staff are generally stretched fairly thin at many, if not most, housing authorities. And so some of the solutions that we might propose to make properties more resilient are very hands-on. For example, portable floodgates that you would deploy right before there's a heavy rainfall. or battery storage, managing how a battery backup system works, making sure drains are cleared, making sure gutters are drained in a timely fashion in the fall. Those things all require hands-on attention from staff who sometimes just don't have enough time to do those things. In addition, some of the tenants are not always the most savvy when it comes to complicated technology. As an example, the image that you're seeing there is the remote that comes with a lot of mini split heat pump systems, and mini splits are great. They use a lot less electricity for heating than, say, electric baseboards, and they also provide air conditioning, which helps with extreme heat problems. However, those remotes are very complicated, and in many cases, tenants don't really understand how they work. We've heard from a number of housing authorities that sometimes tenants get confused, in particular elderly tenants, and they inadvertently shut off their air conditioning during the summer. They then have to put in a service call to maintenance, and then the maintenance staff has to come out and address just a mis-switched remote, or thermostat in this case, which doesn't make them particularly happy because, again, they're stretched fairly thin. And lastly, on the operations side, some of the incentives and the structure around the operations of housing authorities and how they relate to DHCD doesn't position itself to advance resiliency efforts as quickly as we would like. For example, DHCD reimburses housing authorities, almost all housing authorities, for all of their utility costs. And so there isn't an incentive for housing authorities to reduce their electricity, natural gas, water, etc. consumption, because they don't necessarily get, proportionate to what they've reduced, money back from DHCD. And in addition, on the insurance side, DHCD bids on insurance for housing authorities collectively. And what that means is that if you have a housing authority who they don't clear their gutters and a building floods as a result, that risk, that additional exposure, is sort of masked by all of the other housing authorities. So there isn't an incentive for housing authorities to make sure that they maintain a lot of these more hands-on pieces of resiliency equipment. On the other hand, it also means that housing authorities that are in very flood-prone areas are able to get coverage because they're balanced out by housing authorities who are at less risk. And just for some context, insurance premiums that housing authorities collectively pay went up about 65% for this year, 2021's coverage, compared with 2019. So just in 2 years, the premiums went up 65%. So it's a huge expense that needs to get paid, but sometimes the incentives don't line up perfectly. So you may at this point be thinking, well, why not just relocate some of these developments? If they're in a hazardous area, why not just build a new development in a less hazardous area, sell off the existing one, relocate the tenants, and there you go. So let's walk through an example. So this is a public housing, state-funded public housing development. It's got 11 buildings, 80 units. It's on about 3.2 acres, built in the mid-60s, and it houses elderly tenants. If we take this view from a FEMA flood map, you can see the orange lines. Those delineate wetlands buffers. So that's where some of the regulations around what you can do with the site start to kick in, and you can see that that orange line at the bottom goes right through the parking lot and building number 4. And then just a little bit more to the southeast is sort of that darker colored line, and that delineates where the wetlands actually start. So this development is right next to some wetlands area and has reported flooding multiple times within the last 10 years to varying degrees. To zoom out a little bit, where that circle is where the development is. This is the flood zone. It's in the 1% annual floodplain, meaning it's got a 1% chance in any given year of flooding. This line that comes right down the middle is the Charles River. So it's right next to a major body of water. And this flood map is not predictive of future climate change. So it is not, put it to you this way, the development already floods, like I said. So to certain degrees, that 1% is already showing that it is out of date. What are some of the challenges around replacing this particular development? I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with residential land in Massachusetts, but like it is in so many other parts of the country, it is extremely expensive. To purchase a 3.2 acre parcel would be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. In addition, because DHCD is a public entity, we have to do public bidding and pay prevailing wage. And that means that on average, we're looking at about $400,000 per unit of housing being built. So for this development in particular, you're talking $32 million, and that doesn't include the cost of the land. That's just for the buildings themselves. And then there's the question of what can you do with the old site? Given its proximity to the wetland, it's worth significantly less to developers than it might be if it were not, because there are certain restrictions, like I said, placed on that land. And so it's not as though we could very easily sell that and recoup a large portion of the 32 million plus that it would take to redevelop that elsewhere. There's some good news for that development, though, and that is that we're working on it. This is one of the places that we did our pilot site assessments. These are some of the suggestions that came back. I don't expect you to read through all of them, but at quick glance, you've got everything from site improvements to building interiors and different kinds of systems, along with some cost estimates, which are on the lower side because they didn't take the public procurement and prevailing wage into account. But we're working on this particular development, in particular, studying what types of site improvements and building improvements can be made given the topography of the specific site and its proximity to the wetland. And last but certainly not least, coordination continues, and this is no longer a challenge. This is sort of an optimistic slide here. We continue to work with partners statewide on resiliency efforts. There's a group that's called RMAD, Resiliency Massachusetts Action Team. It's a whole bunch of state agencies all working together to coordinate resiliency efforts. In addition, there's the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, and that is a source of funding for towns and cities to do both resiliency planning and actually fund projects. We are actively maintaining project lists, whether it's priority developments or common project types across multiple developments that we could spin up in a short period of time as funding allows. And although DHCD is, I think, out ahead of many other state agencies, and we're doing a great job, we don't have a ton of time to get to work on many of these because, like I said, some of them are flooding already, and climate change continues to make weather less predictable and the impacts greater. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we're glad to do it. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you, to Fatima, Simone, and to Greg. We're going to take some time now, just as a large group, to pick up on any questions for you. If you wouldn't mind unsharing your screen, we're going to stop recording.